Ukraine is preparing to evacuate its citizens from Israel and Iran. Israel has threatened that Iran's supreme leader could repeat Hussein's fate, and why U.S. intelligence believes Iran was 3 years away from building a nuclear weapon. We'll talk about that and more with David Sharp, war correspondent. David, hello. Hello, Olga. Thank you very much. The support is very important. David, Ukrainian diplomats are preparing evacuation lists and plans for citizens in Israel and Iran, according to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Due to the worsening security situation in the Middle East, the ministry urges Ukrainians to leave both countries as soon as possible. How vulnerable is Israel to large-scale retaliatory strikes? What's the current situation? David, over to you. Israel is certainly being hit on a daily basis, and this is causing civilian casualties. As we speak to you, 24 people have been killed, all during the war with Iran, all exclusively civilians, and almost without exception, women, children, and the elderly. The Iranians are striking military facilities, military-industrial complex, and special services, but they are also striking massively and purposefully, and this is important to emphasize, they are striking populated areas. In a number of cases, when there were human casualties, there were not only no military bases, I emphasize none at all, but also no military-industrial complex facilities within the radius of the missile hit. Naturally, the alerts and firings are relevant to practically the entire territory of Israel. The missile defense system copes with the task very well. Even at the planning stage of the operation, the worst-case scenarios were assumed. However, there is no such thing as 100% success when confronting a very serious enemy, especially when we are talking about salvos of dozens of medium-range ballistic missiles flying at tremendous speed, often with a detachable warhead and a warhead weighing half a ton or even a ton.
баллистических ракет средней дальности, летящих на огромной скорости, часто с отделяющейся боевой частью и полтонна боеголовка.
It is a very difficult task. So even if you manage to intercept more than 80% of the missiles, which is about what you can estimate at the moment, here's an example. Out of 50 missiles, you intercepted even 90%, which is a great result, but 5 still hit. And when cities are literally shelled, every missile, with few exceptions, that hits a city does serious damage. Regarding the evacuation of Ukrainian citizens from Israel, of course everyone will make their own choice, but it's a bit ironic if someone who was in Israel thought that it was safer there than in Ukraine, and today will decide the opposite. However, everyone decides in their own way. In any case, evacuation today is very difficult, because airplanes do not fly from Israel. It is possible to get out through land borders, through Jordan, Egypt, in complicated ways. However, those who wish to do so can probably take a yacht to Cyprus and travel by sea. As for Iran, the situation there is different, and I cannot say anything about Iran and the issues of evacuation from that country.
Ситуация там другая, и за Иран, и вопросы эвакуации из этой страны я ничего сказать не могу.
David, the United States has not appealed to Iran for peace talks and expects its complete surrender. This was stated by U.S. President Donald Trump. He announced this on board the presidential airplane. When asked by a journalist about what could be better than a truce, Trump noted that it is about the end of hostilities. He also emphasized that a complete surrender of Iran is quite possible in the near future. What exactly does Washington mean by saying surrender? David, what instruments of pressure do you think the U.S. plans to use to achieve this? Military, economic, or diplomatic? Well, the important thing here, when we comment on Trump's statements on an almost daily basis, is to understand his peculiar manner. You don't want to take some things literally, the way they sound. Plus, he, with few exceptions, tries to avoid political correctness. He speaks undiplomatically, sometimes on a purely emotional level. Apparently, if you decipher the phrase about surrender, you can say something like this: The offer made to Iran in the negotiations with the United States implied the abandonment of the most important component of the nuclear program. That is, various points were discussed, but the key demand was to abandon uranium enrichment on Iran's own territory. As an alternative and a kind of carrot, Iran was offered to enrich uranium within the framework of an international consortium, say, on the territory of Saudi Arabia. After that, if Iran needed a certain amount of enriched uranium for peaceful purposes, it would receive it from this consortium in doses and under the control of a certain mechanism. In exchange for this, of course, it was offered the easing or lifting of sanctions, i.e., significant economic preferences. But Iran, which wants to build nuclear weapons and has all the tools to do so, has invested tens of billions of dollars in this program over many years and has been willing to tolerate sanctions by the United States and the rest of the world, suffering losses that probably exceed 100 billion, if not more, for quite some time, has refused. And in fact, this is probably what President Trump means, although again, it is a thankless task to decipher exactly what the American president means. He could have called it a compromise, he could have put it more diplomatically, and it would probably be more appropriate not to publicly embarrass Iran, as they say, because it's much harder for Iranians to accept even a potentially favorable offer if it's made in an insulting way, especially in the East where such nuances are critical. If the offer was framed in a softer, more veiled way, even with the same content, it would have a better chance. Moreover, with regard to coercive measures, the concept itself is relative. In the end, military strikes can be carried out, but the choice is always left to the other side. Israel has conducted military strikes, and so far they have been extremely effective. Iran has suffered very significant damage, including the disabling of a number of nuclear infrastructures. In general, there is a lot to list. For Iran, it was literally a shock. They did not expect this kind of damage. They did not expect the extent of the enemy's capabilities. It is quite obvious. They have to make a choice to continue or to stop because otherwise the situation for them will get much worse. And the factor of the United States' involvement is very important, because if the United States intervenes in the war, to say that Iran will be bad is to say nothing. It's not that it's going to feel good right now. So far, the Americans are helping Israel in defense. They are involved in intercepting drones on the territories of Iraq and Jordan. They have deployed a battery of THAAD complex and a battery of Patriot on the territory of Israel, which help intercept missiles. This is a smaller part of the missile defense system that Israel has in place, and as far as I understand, the same kind of assistance has been provided to Ukraine for quite some time. But a transition to a qualitatively new level would help in solving the Iranian problem, which is not limited to a threat to Israel. After all, the Iranian threat is a challenge for many countries in the region, which prefer to sit quietly, letting Israel do its dirty work, and also publicly condemn it, while in their hearts they rejoice at what is happening. This is a threat to the entire world to one degree or another. Iranian weapons kill Ukrainians or destroy Ukrainian cities every day. By the way, as a result of these strikes, which have already taken place and which will still take place, I think that the Iranians will get worse, if not already worse, with the supply of certain components of armaments to Russia. In general, much in this war, as in other matters, depends on the position of the United States. Trump's statement is tough. The Americans are waiting for Iran's reaction. What is it prepared to do? Negotiations for the sake of negotiations are not what anyone is interested in right now. Concessions on the past scenario, yes. If not, go figure. Regarding possible American participation in the fighting, I naturally have no information. Even theoretically, it is not even theoretically possible that Iran itself will hit American bases. At least they have threatened to do so, and pro-Iranian forces in Iraq have already taken steps in this direction a couple of times. A couple or 3 drones have attacked American bases. However, When evaluating such a potential move, whether it would be smart from Iran's point of view is up to them to decide for themselves how to proceed and what makes more sense. David Israel said that Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei could repeat the fate of former Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. This is reported by CNN. The corresponding statement was made on Tuesday by Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant at a meeting with the military in Tel Aviv. He emphasized, "I warn Iran and its dictator against continuing war crimes and firing rockets at Israeli cities. Here's your opinion. How seriously can Israel consider the scenario of physically eliminating or overthrowing Iran's supreme leader? Is this military rhetoric or is a real plan possible?" Well, first of all, it's rhetoric too. In war, loud statements, threats are exchanged, and sometimes this is an important component of the, let's call it, media component of war. Let's touch on more practical matters. So overthrowing the regime as such, that is, regime change, of course this is not in the Israeli forces, and this is not the goal. Of course it is a solution to the Iranian problem in general, and very many people in the region and in the world dream of that, and in Iran itself, probably the majority of the Iranian population dream of regime change. But there are only two ways to change regimes, either by external occupation, like Hitler's Germany in its time, and before they took Berlin and the rest of Germany under control, there was no regime change, or by revolution or military coup or something like that. Well, democratic elections in Iran are not on the agenda. To stimulate a revolution, of course, you can strike at the components that the regime relies on. Israel is doing that, and Israel will probably do that, depending on how the war goes, more actively. But beyond that, it's still in the hands of the Iranian people. Even if Iran's leader Khamenei is killed, if there is no revolution or military coup, someone new will take his place. While this will be a heavy blow and a very important symbolic event, we move on to the lower level, the actual liquidation. The comparison with Saddam Hussein suggests that he was caught and hanged as part of an operation to occupy Iraq. In this case, Israel cannot and will not occupy Iran. That is absurd, unless the people of Iran catch and hang Khamenei. As for Israel, before the start of the operation, as far as we know, the possibility of eliminating Ali Khamenei was considered, but it was decided to attack purely military targets and those related to the nuclear program. Attacking the leaders of countries, even hostile ones, even those who have their hands in the blood of Israelis, as in the case of Khamenei, is a very serious step. Many people think Israel has attacked Iran right now, but it hasn't. Iran attacked Israel decades ago. After the overthrow of the Shah's regime, the new regime in Iran declared that it did not recognize Israel's right to exist and has waged a variety of wars against Israel ever since. Specifically, the current leader of Iran authorized more than 30 years ago the bombing of the Israeli embassy in Argentina and the bombing of the Jewish community in Buenos Aires. And dozens of people who had nothing to do with Jews and Israel were killed by his direct decision and in the execution of his people, and there are many such examples. Declarations of Israel's destruction and nuclear weapons are not just words, but actually what they did, which led Israel to realize that it could not go on like this, especially since Iran is much closer to developing nuclear weapons. So the question arises, is it worth eliminating such a leader? There are different rumors. Some say that they decided not to touch the leaders for now, limiting themselves to strikes on the military command. Others, more reliable, that the Americans considered it inexpedient and Trump vetoed it, making it clear that they are helping and giving the green light. But the elimination of the leader is undesirable now. The Israelis seem to have heeded this opinion. Whether this was actually the case is unknown, but the possibility of liquidation was there but not used. Could it be used later? Quite possibly, and this is what Israeli leaders are saying. But it is important to note that when the war started, Khamenei naturally moved, which is understandable.
Хаменеи, естественно, переместился, это понятно.
Any leader has to be in a safe place, or at least think he is safe there, and it may be difficult to physically reach where he is now, especially if it is deep underground. Sometimes even knowing the location is impossible to get to, and sometimes they don't know for sure. If there is a physical opportunity to reach it, it will be weighed sooner or later and probably utilized. In the meantime, the day we spoke was very telling in the destruction of Iran's new chief of staff of the armed forces, the commander-in-chief, in Tehran in the line of duty. It's not known at this point whether he was deep in a bunker or whether he was caught at another stage, but it's very telling. Israel has real-time information about the whereabouts of many key figures in Iran, has the ability to strike from the air, and sometimes not just from the air, so it's unlikely that Iran's leaders should feel complacent.
Есть возможность дотянуться до них с воздуха, иногда и не только с воздуха, и поэтому вряд ли лидеру Ирана стоит дышать спокойно.
David, he was only 4 days on the, as Ukrainians say, posad, and there was no surprise effect here. When there is an effect of surprise, anyone can be caught if there is an opportunity. On the first day of the attack, part of the Iranian command was destroyed precisely by surprise. By the way, not all of them. The entire headquarters of the military space forces of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, headed by the commander responsible for all the rockets that are being fired at Israel and have already been fired at Israel, was also destroyed after the start of the war, while on duty in his bunker. This is an illustrative example. Yesterday and the day before yesterday, for example, the chief of intelligence of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and his deputy were killed, also during the war and on duty. If I'm not mistaken, this suggests that there is a lot of knowledge about their movements. There are relevant capabilities, and this is a very significant impact on both the combat capability of the Iranian command in terms of decision-making in a continuously rotating environment, and serious media effects. The other players in the Middle East are watching and drawing their own conclusions about the effectiveness of the party's actions.
Ротация непрерывная, так и очень серьезные медийный эффект имеет. Остальные игроки на Ближнем и не Ближнем Востоке смотрят на происходящее и делают свои выводы по поводу эффективности действий сторон.
David, you mentioned nuclear weapons, and U.S. intelligence believes that Iran was not actively pursuing nuclear weapons and was at least 3 years away from being able to make them. CNN is reporting this, and the publication writes that U.S. intelligence assessments have indeed concluded that Iran not only has not actively pursued nuclear weapons, but was about 3 years away from being able to make and deliver them to their chosen target. How credible are these U.S. intelligence assessments?
Мы говорим об очень сложных и секретных материях, что называется, тем более на основании утечки.
We're talking about very complex and sensitive issues, especially on the basis of a leak. I don't know who exactly was the source for CNN, how competent that source is now. Perhaps the information is incomplete or manipulative. Let's get down to the technicalities of what this is about. In recent months and years, many have claimed that Iran is weeks or a couple months away from building a nuclear bomb. It's important to separate the emphasis here. Iran has stockpiled enough enriched uranium to the 60% level to build at least 9 nuclear bombs. That's even the official IAEA verdict. But in order to create a nuclear bomb from the accumulated material, it is necessary to enrich uranium to 90%, which technically takes literally a few weeks or a couple of months, i.e., in this respect it was very close. However, there is another area that is no less important, if not more important, the so-called weapons group, which in the normal sense means the creation of the nuclear bomb itself.
Направление на английском языке и на иврите, оно называется оружейная группа. В переводе на нормальный язык это подразумевает создание, собственно, самой ядерной бомбы.
That is, it is not only about the raw materials used to make a bomb, but also about the construction of an explosive device, to put it simply. For a long time, it was believed that Iran had stopped at this stage at least according to open sources, to avoid sanctions or a strike by Israel and the United States, and yet it supposedly had a year and a half to 2 years to build a bomb. I haven't heard about them having as much as 3 years left in a long time, and I can be blunt. There was a popular belief of a year and a half to 2 years, assuming they don't move forward and try to secretly do it further. As far as we know, a year ago, Israeli intelligence received information that Iran had begun to move in this direction. Not very fast, it was called in slang, a dash to the bomb, which can be either fast or slow, gradual. Israel received this information, and what's more, the U.S. intelligence community report last summer, for the first time in a long time, did not include the phrase that the Iranians were still not moving toward a nuclear explosive device, that is, a weapons group.
Впервые за долгое время не присутствовала фраза, что иранцы по-прежнему не продвигаются к ядерной бомбе вот этой оружейной группы.
That, by the way, was a telling hint, in my opinion. So information about how far and how close Iran has come is of course confidential. But for Israel, it was a red line and a directive for a number of reasons, primarily for this reason, as far as we can tell. And there was a consensus in the Israeli intelligence community and political leadership on this issue. That is, this is not some kind of forceful decision by the Prime Minister or individuals, but a very serious decision on which the fate of the country and people for decades to come depends. The decision was made on the basis that Iran is already close, and there could be a situation that in the coming months it will either cross the red line and take possession of the bomb, or it will be in a position where it will be impossible to know exactly where they are at this stage. It was decided to act. As for the 3 years, as I said, it sounds strange. They may have had a year or a year and a half to go, but the important fact is that they moved and began to act, and this is officially approved in Israel. Believe me, the decision to attack Iran is not a political stunt to keep the coalition together or to achieve minor electoral success, as they sometimes like to say.
Как у нас некоторые любили говорить, сохранить коалицию, либо добиться какого-то мелкого электорального успеха или чего-то подобного.
This was a momentous decision, and it was made on the basis of consensus and a great deal of intelligence information. As to how close Iran was to building a weapon and to what exactly, I think there will be many more leaks, including from official U.S. assessments. I might add that the Americans eventually gave the green light to Israel to attack, after realizing that negotiations by this point would not succeed. The Iranians refused to accept American demands, in part because it appears that the Trump administration, his inner circle, and the president himself had been given information available to the Israeli intelligence community, and perhaps the Americans themselves had it. David discussed the following statement, which has been on the rumor mill for several days now. The United States has given Israel air defense systems to combat drones destined for Ukraine. This was confirmed by U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth in a commentary on Fox News. The head of the Pentagon explained that the United States uses all available means to protect its people in the region and around the world. We are talking about Americans, but here we want to ask, not at such a cost, because today there was a terrible attack on Kiev, damaged multi-story buildings, many wounded and dead. Russia continues to terrorize the Ukrainian population, and unfortunately, we do not have many air defenses and missiles capable of shooting down what is flying on Ukrainian territory.
К сожалению, не так много ракет, которые способны сбивать то, что летит по территории Украины.
Of course, it is obvious here that Ukraine has suffered, and people's lives and this or that, let us call it that, property have suffered. This is more than regrettable, but in my opinion, we need to set the accents. Nothing is known about anything being transferred to Israel from what should have been transferred to Ukraine. The U.S. statement said that it was transferred for the needs of the U.S. Central Command, and apparently we are not talking about the systems that were in Ukraine. No one took Patriot systems out of Ukraine and moved them to the Middle East. Apparently, we are talking about the same short-range missiles that the Ukrainian armed forces fire teams use against Shahid drones, which are 70mm laser-guided missiles. The 20,000 was a stretched delivery to Ukraine, as I understand it, planned under President Biden, not just one batch of 20,000 missiles, as far as I can tell, and apparently some of them have already been delivered and some of them are to be delivered over a period of time.
Ракеты калибра 70 миллиметров с лазерным наведением. 20 тысяч, это была растянутая, насколько я понимаю, поставка Украине, запланированная еще при президенте Байдене. Не 20 тысяч одной партии, насколько я могу судить. И, видимо, часть их уже была поставлена, а часть должна поставляться на протяжении энного времени.
The Americans themselves use these same missiles to hunt drones. There is no information that such missiles are even in service with the fighters of the Israeli Air Force, and that they were transferred to the Israeli Air Force. There is simply nothing known about this. Hackett himself spoke about the Americans and American facilities, and everything is quite clear and known here. The Americans have adapted these systems for use from F-15 and F-14 fighters, which saves expensive and scarce air-to-air missiles and allows them to shoot drones at close range, as well as to repeat these actions, since they have several dozen such missiles. With the Houthis, they worked out this scheme in practice, and knowing that war with Iran, including with some involvement of the United States, is becoming urgent apparently, in light of the shortage of these munitions, they transferred part of the shipment, which was intended for Ukraine, for their own needs. It is important to realize that in the end, when it comes to security and interests in the military sphere, any country, I emphasize, any country or any political leader will always choose its own interests, as it is perceived, especially in the security sphere, over the interests of others. This is unfortunate. Often someone suffers because of this and lives have to be paid for it. But nevertheless, it is true. In Israel, we have encountered this situation many times. Unfortunately, war implies such things. It is important to note that this is not the basis of Ukrainian air defense against the Shaheds. It is just one of the few components, and some of these missiles are already in Ukraine. Hopefully, they will continue to arrive in the future. David, and lastly, I would like you to summarize. Can Russia now use the current tensions in the Middle East to its advantage, for example, to weaken its support for Ukraine? In principle, this is probably obvious. And what is Putin's role in this situation, in this conflict, in this war? As for how any players in any situation always try to use it to their advantage, this is a common practice in fact. I see no reason why, for example, Ukraine's European partners might weaken their support for Ukraine because of what is happening in the Middle East. From the point of view of the United States, of course, Trump's current position is radically different from Biden's. Things are not going well here with support for Ukraine, to put it mildly, but again, I see no reason for anything to change for the worse just because of that. That is, the situation could change for the worse or for the better, and I hope so, but it is unlikely that this is the reason. Here's a nuance. In the case of taking away what they call specific ammunition in favor of the American armed forces, yes, it hit Ukraine, but if someone thinks that this was the basis for the entire air defense of Ukraine, that's a mistake. It's just one of the small elements of this system. In principle, there may be minuses, there may be pluses, but if, for example, Russia gets at least a little bit less Shaheds, at least a few less, or can collect a few less Shaheds, you can consider that so they would be shot down with these missiles, so they just won't fly. Clearly, these kinds of comparisons are not very appropriate, but it's hard to add here. Regarding Putin, actually, Russia has its pros and cons. Naturally, oil has risen. On the other hand, they will not get something from Iran. It is hard to say in the end what is more important than what is not. But these are the realities. Everything in the world is interconnected. Regarding his role, At the moment, we can talk about the role of one or another channel for transmitting messages. In general, there are a lot of such players, especially when a war is just beginning in a certain region. Naturally, efforts are made to establish a negotiation process, or let's say, to transmit certain messages to each other. And sometimes this is at the initiative of the participants in the war. Sometimes it is simply someone else's initiative from the outside. Today there are many people who are involved in one way or another in behind-the-scenes contacts between Israel, Iran, the United States, and so on. One of these transmission channels is Putin, because he has contact with Iran. Moreover, it's likely that the Iranians listen to him, at least to some extent, and conversely, he may pass something on from the Iranians. It could be anything. Conditions for the resumption of negotiations, a warning from Israel, for example, that if you hit a certain object, something special awaits you, and vice versa, a warning from Iran in the same vein. In general, this is still a behind-the-scenes and behind-the-scenes diplomacy, in which the active players, Putin is certainly one of them in the Middle East and the international arena, want to achieve some dividends as the one who leads to certain decisions, but to say that his role can be decisive or particularly important in this regard, so far there are no reasons of this kind. In terms of behind-the-scenes messaging, practically everyone is now involved, right down to the Prime Minister of Cyprus. David, thank you very much for this conversation, an interesting and important one. I will remind you that David Sharp, a military observer, was with us live today. Dear friends, please write your thoughts in the comments. We see everything, we read everything. We are grateful for your activity. Please write from which city and from which country you are watching us. David, words of support to you and your people. Hang in there. I wish this day and the next days will be calm. I do not say, see you later. My wishes are absolutely mutual and mirror. All the best and more good news.